All right, we are live. Welcome everyone. As you begin to trickle in for our webinar today, I'm going to throw up a quick poll question while you're waiting. We are really curious what brought you here today. You'll see that poll pop up now. So what prompted you to join our webinar? Maybe it's educational. Maybe you have an upcoming third-party risk management project. You might not be sure where you're at. So if you want to stick around and learn more about third-party risk management, please do. Or maybe you're currently a prevalent customer and we welcome you and thank you for continuing your education. So take a moment to answer that poll as I introduce everyone here. So my name is Amy Tweet. I'm in business development here at Prevalent. My role today is to make sure that any questions, comments, concerns, whatever it may be, they will get to the host. Dave and Scott, you'll see here. So Dave Shackleford is the founder of Voodoo Security. And for this webinar, he's going to highlight the process that organizations should use to prioritize third-party risks. These include identifying risks that pose the greatest danger, building dynamic continuous monitoring for your program, and implementing the active defense strategies and vendor remediations to reduce your attack surface. So Dave will continue on with that. You'll also see this other gentleman here, Scott Lang. He is Prevalent's own VP of Product Marketing. You'll see him pop in more towards the end of the webinar here to chat about how Prevalent can support you in third-party risk management. Any questions or comments you have for these two lovely gentlemen, please pass them on to me by using the Q&A function at the bottom, or the chat function is fine as well. I'm gonna let this poll question up for just a few more seconds. How are you both doing today, Scott and Dave?
I am A-OK. At some point, fall will start, autumn will start here in Ohio. Any day now, I hope. No more 80-degree days, fall coming soon, let's hope.
I see you must have a sweater on, so I think you're wanting it to happen.
Well, we keep the house pretty cold to keep ourselves alert.
Great. How you doing, Dave? Oh, we can't hear you.
Dave, you're on mute.
I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay, welcome.
Woo, yeah. So yeah, I'm great. Thanks for asking. Here in Atlanta, we don't even pretend fall is going to be starting for about another month. So it sort of teases right about this time, but invariably summer sort of comes roaring back a bit for the second half of October all the time. So I'm not even pretending yet, but I'm looking forward to fall. I'm hoping it'll get here soon.
Winter's coming soon enough. All right, before I officially pass it over to you, Dave, just letting everybody know this is being recorded. So if you have to hop off halfway in between, that is okay. This will be sent to your inbox first thing tomorrow. Again, any questions throughout the webinar, use the Q&A function or the chat function. But I'll officially pass it over to you, Dave. Thanks.
Awesome. Now that I'm not on mute and I can actually be heard, and who doesn't want to be heard? I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks so much to everyone attending. This is really has become one of my favorite topics in cybersecurity. The whole concept of third-party risk, just to sort of set the stage here, is not a new one. I mean, we've really been talking about third-party risk for decades because we've had third parties involved in our lives and sort of organizational strategies for many, many years. Now, you go back decades, of course, before, technology, it was sort of a day-to-day element for everything we do. And it was mostly things we were purchasing from vendors. It was suppliers. It was really a supply chain conversation. But now what we find is that our third-party relationships are intimately woven into everything we do all the time, right? It's the use of service organizations. It's purchasing software that's critical for the organization's ability to function on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we can't actually do our jobs and even have a hope to succeed as an organization without some types of third-party affiliations and organizational strategies. And what that means is that every single time, right, every single one of those third parties opens up just a tiny window of potential risk. Now, in some cases, it might be a big window of risk. In some cases, it might be, again, sort of a very minuscule level of risk, but there's always risk. And what that means is that our sort of, bandwidth really in organizations is getting heavily strained. This is one of the things I've really been talking to with a lot of my consulting clients. I also teach for the SANS Institute, and I talk to students in classes all the time about this. And really, I'm just taking the temperature of people out in the industry that are fighting the good fight, trying to keep up with this all over the place. And what I'm finding is that people are exhausted. I'm not telling you anything you probably don't know. And in fact, maybe you're exhausted right now. But the thing is, you can't keep up with it all. And so I looked at this and said, well, you know what? There's got to be a prioritization scheme here. I would love to tell every one of you, hey, go out and keep track of every single possible third-party risk for every single one of your supply chain participants and third-party relationships, but you probably can't. And I've talked to a bunch of procurement teams and vendor management teams. They're all struggling, and especially as this proliferates, right? This growth in third parties tends to increase. And so here we are today with the knowledge that, sure enough, we do have real risks out there. And I'll talk about some of those here momentarily, but we just don't have the bandwidth to keep up with them all. So the whole goal of this presentation is to just talk through some of the top types of issues, the top types of risks that are really worth monitoring out of the gate. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that that does not mean that we shouldn't, go out and try to monitor all the other ones, because I can guarantee you, as I go through this and talk, there's going to be some things that you're thinking and you're like, well, why isn't he talking about this? This is my problem. Of course, there are other issues and there are other risks that you might be bringing into the mix and saying, well, this is the one that bit us. Please, by all means, I get it. We could all hang out probably for about an hour. We were in a big room with a whiteboard and we said, all right, let's just put them on the whiteboard. What are the risks that we need to be concerned with regard to third parties and third party relationships? And we could come up with all sorts of craziness, but you don't have the bandwidth to necessarily focus there all the time. So look, what you have to look at, and we all do this, but you have to look at it through a particular lens. You have to look at the data breaches. You have to look at these intrusions and sort of think to yourself, okay, what does it roll back to? And so there's good and bad with this, right? I actually had this realization a couple years ago, and maybe some of you have had this as well, that we're almost sort of getting to this breach fatigue level. And that's not good, by the way. I'm certainly not insinuating that that's a good thing, but if you hear the same things just happening over and over and over again, it's not that you tune out, but you just get sort of numb to them happening. And that's bad in the sense that we're getting numb to them happening. Let's just, face it. That's not good, especially if it's our organization, then you're definitely not numb to it happening. But what needs to happen there is us sort of going, okay, look, there's a body of knowledge now. So there has to be a silver lining somewhere in this. And I am a reluctant optimist in the field of information security and assurance, just because I think we are actually getting better at this stuff. There's just a lot more of the stuff to deal with. So, that's why we're here. So I look at this and say, okay, we've got a body of knowledge. We've learned a lot about intrusions. We've learned a lot about attack techniques. We've learned how they're occurring. We're also getting a bit better about disclosure. Surprisingly, we're starting to see more third parties and really more organizations holistically that are encountering these types of intrusion scenarios, that are experiencing these breaches, being a bit more open about what happened, at least where they can. Certainly not disclosing things that are going to put them at more risk or that they're not legally able to potentially talk about. But we're learning more. And so that's the cool thing, is through all this stuff that we've been dealing with in the last couple decades, if you really go back and start looking to the breaches that were noted and started gaining some notoriety, it's been since roughly the mid 2000s, right around 2004 or 5 timeframe is when this really started accelerating. And we've learned a lot of things since then. And what we can do is start going, okay, across these various types of breach scenarios, these issues that have been encountered, whether they affected us or not. I think we sort of all have to become researchers in our own right and say, what are we going to learn from this? What are we going to take away? What we can do is say, okay, where they did disclose, where they did talk about, what happened, what kinds of things are going on, that we can focus and say, all right, that's going to be my top area of concern. It's going to be a top area of concern. And I think that's a critical element of this. We've got to adapt our security processes to include all these various types of third parties, vendors, partners, either other business units, especially for organizations working with, service providers, whether it's cloud providers or others, which we all are today, let's face it. I mean, cloud is sort of part of life as well. doing acquisitions. So you go buy another company or you acquire another firm or organization, they've got third parties. So you immediately inherit all of these things, and it's this trickle down effect. Well, now what you've got to do is look inward and say, how are we going to adapt to this? Like, what are we going to deal with? Let's look at our own people. Look at our own processes. Let's look at our own technologies and start asking ourselves, okay, are we equipped to track this, especially as it grows? And number two, out of all of this, what should we be paying the most attention to? Because you can't necessarily focus on everything with the same degree of priority and sensitivity. So, moving into this, right, we've got these expanding risk profiles. And one of the things I've sort of come to the conclusion of, in my past, like, let's say decade in the security field, is that, irrespective of your job title or what you do day to day. So you might have hands on keyboard in the SOC. You might be a pen tester. You could be, anything in between, sort of that, offense, defense approach. But everybody's a risk advisor. That's really sort of our job in pretty much everything we're doing. So if I'm a pen tester, I'm advising you on where I got in or where there's potential to get in and what to do about it, right? If I'm on the other side, if I'm on that sort of defensive side, I'm a risk advisor when I tell you there's some unusual activity over here. That's probably not good. Or we've observed lots of attacks against these assets. Let's talk about shoring up some of the security controls and potential defenses in that area, for example. So we're all risk advisors, but we have more risk profiles than we ever have. And so, number one common issue is just too many third parties. So I've actually had lots of conversations with the procurement teams and vendor management teams about what their processes look like, the questions they're asking third parties. And we all know those questionnaires, right? Some of us have gotten them. Some of us have to develop them. I mean, nobody loves going through hundreds and hundreds of questions all the time. And even if you do, you can't. And so I found in those conversations that I've been having that, many of these teams will reluctantly admit we can't get to it all, right? Like some of these organizations, we send out a questionnaire and we sort of have to take it or leave it. The business is pushing us. They say, hey, we've got to work with this organization. No ifs, ands, or buts. We're not going to do a deep dive into what their responses are if they even give us some of those responses, which isn't great. The other problem I tend to find is that there's not enough operational capacity to monitor what types of risks and challenges are going on out there. So we may acknowledge, hey, we're doing business with this partner or this service provider, and we've gotten some, hopefully acceptable responses in our security questionnaires and risk questionnaires, but do we check back on them? Right? Do we go back 6 months later and say, hey, has anything changed? Let's go through this again. Do we go back 3 months later? Do we go back 12 months later? And again, in some of those conversations, I've been finding that there's just not enough time for it. So you have to say, well, okay, what do I focus on? Whether it's a specific element of those risk profiles or whether it's just the risk profiles altogether. And we might not even have that sort of in-house risk assessment capacity for somebody to review this stuff. And this is really another big challenge organizationally and structurally that I tend to find. It might be a procurement team or a vendor management team that's just sort of trying to keep up with the pace of all this. And they send out a questionnaire, they get some responses back, they kind of just gather the info, but are they really risk analysts, right? There's got to be somebody that understands cyber risk and what that means, because it's getting more complex, not less. And so all of these are challenges that I commonly find. Whether one or more of these is in place, sort of doesn't matter. It tends to snowball over time, especially for big shops that have a lot of these different types of third-party relationships. But again, it all kind of leads us to what we're talking about here, which is the need to prioritize. We really need to prioritize more around what we're doing and what types of security risk we have. And so I'm jumping in, right? Let's start talking about it. And I would say number one is credentials. Now, I have my own sort of feelings about credentials. As somebody that's been a pen tester for over 15 years of my own career, there was a moment, I don't know exactly when this moment was, let's call it, 12, 13 years ago. That's me shooting from the hip. But there was this moment where there was this sort of perception or feeling in the pen testing industry and community, sort of the offensive community as it were, that, using credentials in a pen test was sort of like cheating, right? Like, you've got to find some remotely exploitable service, or, you've got to really show like these kinds of flaws. But what we've realized is that if we're being true to the theme of why pen testing exists in the first place, right? The only thing I think of pen testing as is emulation of adversarial tactics, right? I'm supposed to be the good one that's showing you what the bad ones are going to try to do and get there before they do. That's my whole idea. Well, what we're finding is that the bad folks of the world, right, the adversaries that we're all contending with, are more than happy to use credentials. They don't have any pride. They don't care. It's whatever gets them in to get whatever it is that they need. And what we're finding, sadly, is that there are more exposed credentials in the world than ever before. They proliferate. I think these things multiply after midnight if you feed them or whatever. It's crazy the number of credentials that are just lurking about in all the dark corners of the internet. And if you know what, sort of what's going on in your own organization, and you're tracking that internally, what happens when you move out into cloud-based scenarios, right? What happens when your developers start building things, test environments out in Microsoft Azure or AWS or Google Cloud? They're posting stuff on GitHub. It's just so easy for credentials to be exposed and get out there. That's one factor. But I think there's another one that has to tie into the third-party relationships and the supply chain. And that's the nature of how we do business. So you've got third-party suppliers or third-party providers that might be remotely accessing your environment for some reason. Maybe they're, logging in to do maintenance. Maybe they're logging in to maintain your, heating and air equipment. We certainly saw that problem with a very well-known breach many years ago. There's all these different reasons why credentials are all over the place, not just for us, not just for our stakeholders, right, our employees and contractors, but also these third parties that we do business with. And everywhere that those credentials are located, wherever they might be, there's a potential for exposure or a potential for risk. And that's probably nowhere more prevalent and easily illustrated than with the debacles around Amazon S3 servers. Now, fortunately, in, I'd say maybe the past 3 years, we've seen a little bit of a reduction in this, at least public disclosure of some of this. Right? It's still happening, but it really felt like between, I'll say 2014 or 15 and maybe 2018, it was almost every day. It felt like somebody was getting, exposed via an Amazon S3 server. But here's the thing. If you go out and say, well, we don't even have any Amazon S3, right? We're not using these storage buckets. How is our data somehow exposed there? It's because of your third-party relationships, because you may not be using S3, you might not be using any cloud storage at all, but they are. And that is where the problems come in. And I remember, distinctly, I do a lot of work in cloud security too. And I was doing that work when this, started to really unfold and become a big issue. I remember looking at some of these S3 exposure scenarios and just genuinely scratching my head and going like, what was, what were they thinking? Right? I think we've all had a couple what were they thinking moments over the past decade, but to me, nowhere more so than why in the world did you have this data in the format that it was in? Number two, why did you put it into an S3 bucket and then open it up to the world? And that is a really big problem. So I don't know if these numbers are still right. This is a screenshot of a headline from a few years ago. 7% of all S3 servers are exposed. I don't know if that's still the number or not, but they are still out there and they're not hard to find. And so that is really a big issue. So I kind of picked a couple examples here just to sort of talk through this, because it is all about third parties, really. It's not, it's not the organizations themselves. It's these ancillary cases where, oh my gosh, they had our data, they had our credentials. And so, the top one on this list still to me stands out as one of the big, what in the world is going on scenarios. Now, look, I don't mean to, bash anybody. I don't mean to sort of, get into this organization is just, doing dumb things or behaving badly. I don't know what was going on over at Booz Allen Hamilton at the time. So if you have affiliations with Booz Allen, if you work for Booz Allen, please don't think I'm picking on you. I'm really not trying to. This is just what it is. But you're talking about one of the world's largest and most well-known defense contractors. Let's just reemphasize that. Defense contractor, okay, right? So we're not talking about somebody that's building, like children's toys or something. No. We're talking about defense contractor, right? So defense contractor has credentials and passwords, also known as credentials, to U.S. government systems, right? So they're obviously on like a contract or something, and somebody thought it would be a great idea not only to stash those pretty much in clear text, which is horrifying in its own right, but to do so in an S3 bucket that was then either purposefully or inadvertently exposed to the world. And when I saw this one, I just, like slow head explosion happened right there. But look, we've seen so many more of these that you just go, okay, well, apparently this is what you're doing, right? I mean, Verizon, had a huge leak through a partner, right? So it was a bunch of Verizon customers and their names and account details and sometimes even their account pins, but it wasn't Verizon that posted this stuff out there. It was a partner, right? It was a third party that they had a relationship with. And, again, there's just so many cases of this that are happening out there. And this, the second factor here is, or the second example down sort of towards the bottom is another great example. It's Facebook. So I'm like, okay, if you're a Facebook user, which I think like 1 in 6 people on the planet are Facebook users today. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's a lot. You say, okay, well, where is my data related to Facebook? Now, look, I will say we're talking about social media. So things get tricky because social media sites, really you are the product. Your data is, who knows where it's going and where, where it's, and I'm sure everybody here who is a Facebook user has read through that EULA extensively, line by line, when you signed up, right? You know exactly what they're going to be doing with your data, right? Yeah, of course you do.
Hey, Dave.
Well, it turns out they're selling it. Yeah.
Hey, quick question that came in that is relevant before you move on. So someone was wondering if it is the responsibility of the customer or Amazon, back when you were chatting about Amazon. I'm not sure if you got that covered, but wanted to make sure that was brought back.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, great question. And the one I was talking about was also Amazon. This is all Amazon S3.
Okay.
And it's just a matter of, people exposing this stuff. It is unequivocally the responsibility of the customer. Not even a question, because here's the thing. Amazon gives you all the tools to lock this stuff down. And in fact, the S3 buckets, and this is one of those, again, just mind-blowing revelations that you come across. Amazon S3 buckets do not start publicly exposed. In fact, they're pretty locked down by default, which means somebody had to go in and open it up. So like, I've got these clear text credentials. They want to be free, my friends. Let them be free and proliferate across the internet. That's actually exactly what you should not be saying. But sadly, people have. So there you go. Now you've got, credentials that are definitely free and being shared freely, by the way, for anybody that's come across those S3 buckets. But great question. It is 100% the responsibility of the customer, whoever that customer is that's responsible for the S3 bucket. But again, if you're the victim, it's your credentials with a partner, then the partner screwed up. You're still the one that's affected, but it's your partner's fault. And so again, there's all sorts of blame that you can point at, but we're talking about 540 million Facebook records that got exposed. And there was another one actually that had a bunch of, again, clear text credentials in there too. It's the same thing, it's the same old problem. It feels like a broken record. Right? Talking about S3, you're just like, really again? Oh my gosh, why? Why does this keep happening? I just don't understand. And look, here's another great example of this, right? And again, it's starting to sound like I've got a big AWS theme here. It's not so much AWS. It's just because people started building out so much stuff in the cloud so quickly. I think we see a lot of this, right? We see a lot of AWS-centric exposure of credentials that, you realize, oh my gosh, our credentials are in the hands of developer X or third-party service provider Y, and they're not taking good care of them. And here's another case where the developers were posting stuff out onto GitHub. And this, again, this is the consistent scheme that we've seen over and over and over happening. In fact, so bad that this became such a big problem, right? Trivia for the day from Dave. This became such a big problem that AWS themselves started scanning GitHub regularly, looking to find whether their customers had potentially exposed credentials accidentally. right? So if the cloud provider is doing this, they're that worried about it, it's a big problem. Again, this has fortunately gotten a little bit better in recent years. People are starting to be a bit more cognizant of their credentials and where they are. But look, let's get back to the crux of this, right? We're talking about areas to prioritize. And what I suggest is saying, hey, look, where are my credentials? Who's got access to these? Who's got a hold of them? And what are they doing with them? So priority number one in the third-party risk, sort of universe, as it were, should absolutely be where your credentials live, who's got them, and what they're doing. So again, here's just another example, right? And this is a hugely egregious one, where somebody just wasn't paying attention at all. And it turns out that cloud providers will just continue to spend your money associated with those accounts until they can't anymore. And by the way, that's me not knocking them. It's saying, hey, look, this is the nature of how these services work. You provide credit card information or what have you. And if you're, building stuff and charging it, then, hey, guess what? They're going to come back and bill you for that. And this is a developer that lost credentials and ended up having a bunch of stuff in the account get spun up. In fact, Amazon even reached out to this person and said, hey, you're spending a lot of money. Is this normal? Missed the email. You couldn't make this stuff up. This is actually it seems like a bad joke. But it's not. And so again, fortunately, we've learned some lessons, but you as an organization should really be prioritizing these credentials, right? To make sure that you don't end up like this, so that you don't end up having your data exposed or some data exposed in such a way that, again, it causes you harm by virtue of a third party that lost the control over credentials that for some reason you had provided them. That's the key. Now, same thing goes, obviously we could flip that around. If you're the third party and you're the one in charge of the credentials, take this to heart. This should be the number one thing you're really thinking about protecting too. It's on you to protect those credentials for your partners and your, potential customers that you're working with. So you really got to pay attention to this one. Obviously this is an area that I think we get, right? If you got credentials under your control, you need to keep them under your control and ensure that they're not exposed inadvertently or purposefully anywhere. Okay. So priority number two is, what we're calling data breach chatter. And really this is, unfortunately, how a lot of people are discovering that they have a data breach is they're getting informed by a third party who, finds this stuff and says, oh, hey, your data is out there. Well, we need to be paying close attention to the chatter around this stuff, right? And there are lots of forums where this stuff is occurring out on the dark web or other places where, again, we've got to start, building out a threat intelligence model that includes this. Now, look, most organizations, truthfully, don't have the operational capacity or even the skills to just get out there and dig around online and try to, sort of embed themselves in these sort of dark web or underground forums, because, again, we just don't have time. But there are plenty of great services that do this and can inform you, hey, there's some discussion around a potential data breach of X. Now, in this case, X could be a third party that you work with. And that's the whole point here, is if you've got an ecosystem of third parties that you're working with, it's not only enough for you to just try to defend your house, you got to keep track of potential, cases where they didn't defend theirs because they've got access to you, they've got access to your data, you have some affiliation or partnership with them that could even result in, just exposure and embarrassment and sort of the collateral damage in terms of reputational factors there. So there's a lot of reasons why, you're sort of joined at the hip, at least with some of your critical partners and third-party services. And if they've got a problem, you want to know about it as soon as possible to try to get in front of that. So again, this concept of monitoring and sort of bringing in some threat intel, looking for chatter or discussion around data breaches, I think is really critical. And here's a great example of this, right? So I'm sure most of you, probably all of you, are familiar with the Capital One breach that happened back in 2019. The things I have to say here. So number one, Capital One, I've actually had the distinct pleasure of speaking with a number of their security team members and some of their architecture team, folks over the years at conferences and such. It's a sharp bunch of folks, really. They're good. They know what they're doing. They have lots of strong technical skills. And when this got announced and we heard about it, it took me really by surprise because I said, wow, they're really a good organization. They're very skilled. They know what they're doing. So if it can happen to them, it could happen to anybody. That's what I took away. I looked at this and said, wow, if Cap One can have this kind of a problem, we should all pay attention because, look, the attackers are getting savvy enough to figure out how to breach really sophisticated organizations like this. And that means, if you're less sophisticated than Cap One, you're potentially at risk. And so, of course, we all know the story here, lots of credit applications, social security numbers, bunch of stuff. But the way that this occurred was through manipulation of a bunch of AWS controls. That's, obviously important. We need to understand what kinds of techniques and tactics the attackers are pursuing and sort of evolving with. But in this context, in this discussion, it's how did we find out? Here's how we found out. We found out because this particular attacker was out on a number of sort of underground forums and was posting about it, right? So I don't know about you. If I rob a bank, I'm not going to go tell everybody. It just seems like a bad strategy, like bad criminal, bad criminal. But hey, whatever. I'm glad that this individual did in fact go talk about it because somebody saw that and said, oh my gosh, this person's obviously just breached Cap One. Let's go let them know about it. And so they found out, right? So you look at this and say, well, okay, if you were a partner of Capital One, and there are probably thousands and thousands and thousands of organizations that are, the sooner you know about this and can get in front of it, the better, right? So, having those sort of monitoring capabilities, having visibility into some of these underground, sort of dark web forums, or having a threat intelligence service that can provide that to you, really something that I view as a must-have the more third parties you've got, right? Like just assuming that everybody's doing the right stuff out there and that it's all, it's all going well is not a good strategy, and it is not a good assumption to make. So again, looking for that chatter, that is number two. Third one, third-party compromise, right? So related, obviously, we're talking about security incidents or like actual validated attacks, not just the sort of data exposure or the chatter about that, but really, looking at this and saying, okay, third parties have been breached, third parties have been compromised in some significant way. And, I think the gift that keeps on giving here, and probably one that we're going to be talking about for years to come, it's SolarWinds, right? So, you're saying to yourself, look, this is a trusted provider of software that so many organizations are using and relying on. And not just software, but software that tends to have excessive or extensive privileges in the environment based on what it does, right? We're talking about monitoring software. We're talking about system control and configuration software. And what we really need to be thinking about is, wow, that software, what if it goes bad on us, right? What if it breaks bad and now it's doing horrible things in the environment? How did it get there? That's, one thing, obviously. But it's also about sort of doing that inventory and saying, well, okay, what are the critical services and products and things that we're using? What do we know about those third parties? And what are we asking them, and what are we trying to validate about them related to potential third-party risk? And there you go, right? SolarWinds, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse progressively, right? It was this really perfect storm of, oh my gosh, the software supply chain has legitimately been owned. And we've been talking about this forever. In fact, we had lots of discussion around this when I started in security, which was ancient history. I actually started in the security industry in the 1990s, which is, again, ancient history. And we were already talking about this. Like, what if we're installing stuff that's bad? But what we were thinking of more was, oh, well, we downloaded something bad, or, something of that nature. That's not really it so much. It's, in this case, like total root, break-in. I mean, really, the software development practice was breached and nobody knew about it. And so everything looked good as far as what was delivered from SolarWinds, right? Like all the hashes matched, the packaging was intact. Like it was their software. It wasn't like somebody compromised a software repository online and replaced it with something evil. It was embedded in their actual code. And that's something that we had been talking about for a long time, but we had never truly realized at the level of scale that occurred here. And so I hate all the work that everybody had to do and go scramble with SolarWinds. And I hate it for SolarWinds as much as anybody else. You never wish these kinds of things upon anyone, but we learned a lot from this breach. There's a lot of benefits that, again, those silver lining moments that come out of this. And if there's nothing else that we can take away, it's we really got to pay attention to this stuff, right? We've really got to ask questions, know your critical vendors, know your critical suppliers, know what they're doing. You know, don't take it for granted. Don't take anything at face value, dig and push. And we should be doing that more. And I like the fact that there is that pressure now, right? Number 4, talking about misconfiguration and vulnerabilities. Our partners have infrastructure just like we do. So, you know, they've all got, you know, infrastructure that they got to maintain. They've got web services. They've got, you know, servers and containers and, you know, all the crazy things that we're all running. They're running this, you know, same kinds of things. Okay, well, how are they managing configuration? How are they managing vulnerabilities, right? So vulnerability management, configuration management, and emphasis on that across the spectrum of their technology stack, incredibly important because look, let's face it, this is where the problems are coming in. And, you know, would they know if, for example, something had been compromised in their environment and was now communicating with a command and control server? How would they know? We should ask that, right? So I look at this and, you know, look at some of the stuff from the most recent Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, which is a great report, right? It tells the story of a lot of things going on out in the world, if nothing else. You know, I always look and say, is anything changing here? Like what are the trends over the years? And, you know, I, for one, I'm going to tell you guys right now, I'm getting sick of seeing social engineering at the top. I think you're probably sick of it too, but it's here to stay, right? We're going to see that one at the top of the list. So I almost sort of push that one to the side. I'm like, yep, okay, people are clicking on links again. Okay, I go to the number 2. So I always go to number 2, and hey, guess what? It's web apps. And so I dug a little bit further into the report this year, as I'm sure some of you probably did as well. And they gave a little bit more context in that. They said, look, it's not just web apps, it's web apps in the cloud. So growth in cloud and the use of web apps, everything's kind of a web app today. The attackers are going after this stuff because we're not configuring them well, and we're not patching and fixing the vulnerabilities in that infrastructure quickly. And guess what? Your partners aren't either. Third parties aren't doing this, and we need to ask them how they're managing configurations and how they're approaching vulnerability management as well. Now, the final one that I'll talk to here is fraud activity. The whole concept of fraud activity can really be a big area, right? So, I mean, you could, you know, call out a lot of things in this space, but I look at things like, you know, basically trying to create, you know, fake names and domain name registrations, right? And look, we've all seen this stuff. It seems trivial, right? When you look at it like this, like, oh my gosh, who's actually going to get fooled into going to PayPalInspection.com? Lots of people, they're clicking those links, right? We know this. But this is legitimate, and we need to be monitoring for this type of fraud. We need to be monitoring for, you know, sort of these fake, you know, domain names that resemble ours. We need to be looking at, you know, sort of brand protection and whether people are spinning up fake sites that look like ours. This is all about sort of that online ecosystem of brand and the exposure of our brands and our organizations through mimicking and through some of these, you know, really kind of low-level tactics that are surprisingly effective if we don't know about them, right? So I think this is something that we not only need to do for ourselves, once again, for our third parties. So if you do business with abc.com and somebody registers abcd.com and they're mimicking them and, you know, basically creating reputation issues, they're, you know, basically involved in phishing activities or other criminal tactics, that stuff comes back to you, right? You're tied to them, they're doing bad stuff or not paying enough attention. And so I think you have to broaden and sort of widen the net when you're talking about fraudulent activity. It's not just us anymore. It's also those third parties that we're doing business with. So this is where, you know, again, you look at where to sort of focus and where to prioritize. I think you have to sort of say, all right, who are my most critical third parties? I need to really go dig in, get my information from them, you know, make sure that I'm tracking this stuff and sort of, you know, adding visibility across the spectrum and make that a cyclical approach, right? I think the days of we checked in with them once this year, that's not enough. You need continuous monitoring. And I know that's a loaded term, and it has been a loaded term forever, honestly, since the minute it came out. But the time is now. We actually have to build that. And we have to do so for, at the minimum, you know, our preferred vendors and ideally any other third parties that we're associated or affiliated with as well. So yeah, does it start with risk questionnaires? Sure, it starts with risk questionnaires. We all know these, right? AppSec, audit and compliance. I won't read that whole list to you. You don't need me to. You're probably well enough familiar with pretty much everything on that list. yourselves. But going back to those priorities, look, there's a couple things in there that you really need to emphasize. Number one, how are they managing configuration? Change in config management, that's a big one, especially in the spectrum of all these web services that people are building. Things like, really the credentials that are exposed. We're talking about identity and access management and the governance of identity and access management. That's a specific area that might need a little bit more attention based on what we're seeing out there, right? So yeah, we need to start going through these reviews, right? Reviewing these third-party controls, deciding on a list of controls that they need to demonstrate compliance. But like I said, they're not all created equal. Now, look, I'd love to see this sort of ironclad list of things that every one of our third parties was doing. You would too. But across what they're telling us, you need to not only, maybe scrutinize some things more than others, but even that's not enough. So if all you've got is a, questionnaire that they filled out and responded to, I'm going to argue that that isn't good enough anymore. I think we really need some continual observance and third-party monitoring of everything going on out in the environment as well. So that can start with software reviews, right? Looking at the software that we're bringing in, checking things like gold images. Again, SolarWinds was a great example of this, finding out how they're managing and sort of, dealing with monitoring their software supply chain and software pipelines. But, above and beyond that, you need this sort of bigger picture in the technology space to say, hey, what are the real risks here? If SolarWinds goes bad, that's a much bigger problem than this one little app that two people use that isn't really sensitive, at all. So it's all prioritization. It's not just these 5 things that I've been talking about here. It's, above and beyond that, who are they applying to? And so there's a criticality factor for certain suppliers, certain third parties, and looking at sort of the risk ratings. Look, there's a lot to look at. You're not going to keep up with it all. Is there something that maybe you don't know about one of your third parties that another organization found out accidentally or through some other sort of exposure? You need to know that. So again, keeping track of all this in that whole spectrum, it's all risk assessment. Start with a thorough review with this, procurement team and processes. Look at how vendor reviews get initiated. Obviously look at contract terms, but more so than that, prioritize the certain things that you really need to emphasize in terms of security controls, and really drill into that with your priority vendors as much so as possible, right? So a lot of work to do. None of this is simple, but definitely an area that needs attention more so than ever before. So, again, looking at access reviews, looking at those access controls, who can get in here, right? Looking at the logs coming in from authentication and activity, and obviously making sure that you're monitoring that. That's another big one too, especially with the use of these credentials as sort of the top item on the list. A lot of work, again, right? And truthfully, as I said at the very beginning of this webcast, this is becoming an area that I'm really emphasizing talking about because the ecosystem is growing, right? The nature of our third parties is really the nature of how we do business today. And so if we don't have a good grasp on that, and we don't have a continuous means of sort of keeping up with it and tracking this over time, it's just going to unravel as we start using more third parties as well. So focus on at least a handful of things to start, the big ones, the ones that can cause the biggest issues. And, from there, again, it's a matter of expanding and improving on that over time. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Scott to talk to you guys for a few minutes about what's happening over at Prevalent.
Thanks so much, Dave. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our webinar today. Dave provided some pretty significant and heavyweight guidance here on areas to think about, concerns to be aware of, and some of the top and important risks to really take a closer look into or inspect much more deeply into as you're kind of beginning to ramp up your program a little bit. What I wanted to do was just take a couple of minutes to explain how Prevalent can help simplify that process. Next slide, please, Dave. With all the things that Dave talked about today, getting started is the biggest challenge, right? The longest journeys begin with a single step. And in talking with customers, former prospects, now customers of ours, we learned 3 immutable truths. Number one is they're likely utilizing some manual methods to assess the controls or the credential policies or the software development life cycles or more of their third parties, if there's data sharing going on, and you're never going to be able to capture all the right controls, automate the analysis, and then do some level of remediation on issues that you detect in a spreadsheet. It's just not going to happen. Second, outdated info is a huge issue for a lot of companies that we've talked with. Specifically, if you're not gathering some level of real-time, cybersecurity data on breaches or what's happening in the dark web, hacker chatter, forums, things like that, you're missing out on an important piece of the vendor risks. Executing a one-time annual risk assessment, perhaps at the time of onboarding and more, just isn't going to do the trick. You got to keep up with it throughout the life cycle. And then third, there's tons of people involved. It's not just the cybersecurity team, which I'm sure you are well aware of. Procurement teams, need some input into the third-party risk management process. Vendor managers, legal and compliance, and more. When you get all these different, folks together, everyone has competing priorities, and it just lengthens the time to build and maintain kind of a sustainable third-party program over time to capture these types of risks. Next slide, please, Dave. Our approach really is to execute on three major themes. First, to make you and your team smarter, and we do that by bringing in a ton of intelligent sources that are either currently siloed and maybe being utilized by different folks around the organization, or those that you might not even be aware of, to make all of your risk assessment and risk management decisions data-driven, that it's comprehensive, and that it adds context to your decisions as well. Once you onboard your vendors and more, there's a lot more to it than that. It's about maintaining some real-time visibility into some of those risks. Second is unification. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's more than just about executing that one-time assessment, maybe during onboarding or maybe during contract renewal on an annual basis. It's also about maintaining some real-time element to that. And the downside is a lot of companies using two different tools for that. They don't talk to one another. We can help bring that together to unify your risk response. And then finally, our approach is to be much more prescriptive than perhaps other methods out there that are available, especially some of the more manual spreadsheet driven processes, in that we give you very prescriptive steps, next steps, and more to follow to complete the assessment, to score a vendor, and to identify what your next step actions are. Next slide, please. I think some of the secret sauce of the prevalent solution is the amount of inputs that we feed into the platform to help you make good decisions. A lot of this stuff is what Dave talked about, during his part of the presentation, where we're continually trolling data breach sites, regulatory portals, publications, adverse media. We're monitoring for sanctions, pulling in credit reports, threat feeds, code repositories, hacker forums, dark web, chatter forums, and more. And then we're scouring that information, and our analysts are then quantifying it, correlating it with existing risks that you might know about in a central risk register, and then updating that vendor's risk profile based on what we find. Now, when we alert you to that, you have a much better and more complete picture of your third party's risk profile. And as you tier them out, your top tier vendors, you're doing the most critical business with, whatever, you've got a much clearer and a much more definitive picture of the potential risks that those folks could be exposing you to. So the net of it is, like I said, it isn't just about issuing a one-time SIG assessment or some sort of a custom assessment. It's just as important to maintain the real-time element, gathering cybersecurity data, augmenting it with reputational and financial data, and being much more proactive in your assessment approach. Next slide, please. And then, finally, two pieces here. We talked about a prescriptive approach, already. Dave, if you want to move on even to the next slide, that would be good. It's also about the life cycle. I mentioned that risk happens at more places in a relationship than when you onboard somebody or during contract renewal, but also delivering insights about vendor risks that are unique to that stage, helping you onboard folks that match your risk profile or give you some inherent risk visibility on what you need to fix and right size your due diligence, continuously assess and remediate findings, monitor and validate conclusions with, real-time cyber monitoring. Measure SLAs and performance, because that's, an area where a lot of risk can happen due to non-delivery or contract clauses that are not met. And then finally, offboarding. We learned a big lesson with the Morgan Stanley breach on decommissioning servers about how important it is to make sure that, you're offboarding vendors and offboarding data and offboarding, equipment and such with more discipline and rigor to ensure that you're not leaving any, ports open, so to speak. Next slide, please. Honestly, at the end of the day, the outcome is threefold. To give you a much better visibility into the data you need to make good decisions, help your team be much more efficient by knocking down the silos that separate you and from other teams, and then provide you the best practice guidance to help you get started and maintain and grow that program over time. Honestly, that's it. I think to tie it closely to what Dave said in his presentation, he gave you like 4 or 5 big risk areas that you should kind of focus on first, because we're seeing so many of those things. That, all kind of comes naturally and is fed into the platform and is automated in a way that you can see it, act on it, and then ultimately remediate risk down to an acceptable level for your business. So that's all I wanted to share with Amy. Probably time to kick back on and open up for questions.
Hey everyone, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Dave. For those of you still joining us, I'm going to throw up a quick poll question, our last one here, I promise. All right, are you looking to either augment or establish a third-party risk management program in the coming months, or maybe preparing for early next year? If you can take a moment and answer, that'd be really helpful. Yes, no, I'm not sure. As Scott mentioned, we're here to help you mature that third-party risk management program. So if you're not sure where to start or what you want to do, you can reach out to us. We're happy to help. Any other questions that may come up in the next few minutes, feel free to use the Q&A function. But I think Dave and Scott, you got everyone thinking and kind of contemplating on what they want to do next. It's a little bit quiet here in the audience. So if anything comes up, please let us know. But thank you again, both of you, for the information. And if you do have any questions for us here at Prevalent, you can email info@prevalent.net. Follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter. We're here to help. All right, I'll leave that poll question up for a little bit. I think we have a question coming in, a couple questions. Okay, so what is the best approach to not only review third party, but also fourth parties and beyond? It's a great question. See, Dave, are you on mute, Dave? Here, you might be on mute.
Yep.
There you are.
I'm not. I was thinking deeply about my answer there, because it's a huge challenge, right? And truthfully, I don't think there's a single answer. I'm sure Scott's got some thoughts on this as well. But when you talk about third parties, and that's been the emphasis here, I don't think you can obviate fourth parties as well, which means who are they using and their relationships, and that needs to be something that's addressed through questionnaires, through risk review. In fact, that sort of fourth party arrangement and relationship has become a much more sort of common and prioritized series of sort of questions as well, that everybody's asking now. So, good example of this, right? Let's take a software provider that you've been working with, and so you have a strong relationship with them. Again, they're a partner. Let's talk about the examples I gave in the beginning of my presentation. Do you know whether they're using AWS S3 buckets to host things? Well, you're not going to know. That's a fourth party relationship. And so thus, you've got to ask those questions. Are you using third party solutions yourselves that could inadvertently lead to our exposure or our threat surface, and so on? So I think it's a matter of really everything that both Scott and I talk about, but extending that yet another level. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And to add on a little bit, the hardest part of that is discovery, is finding who's who in the zoo outside of that first concentric circle of your third parties, your contributors to those third parties, your fourth and nth parties. And that's where, systems that kind of automatically, maybe troll public sites that return, fourth party connections into, for example, a vendor's website or a customer's website, is a good start at discovery, kind of inventorying and identifying, different apps and vendors that are connecting into that. But also it's about automating some level of assessment to those folks as well, to gather that information. it's hard work. Discovery is the worst part of it. Once you have kind of crossed the discovery threshold and got some level of fourth and nth party inventory, then you can start kind of building, connections between those parties and seeing where data flows and map relationships and all that other stuff. But, either through some sort of an automated scrape or maybe an assessment, that's probably the best way to do it.
Thank you both. All right, other question. Any guidance in developing a business case for third-party risk management? I get this question a lot from people, so I'd love to hear your take on it.
Well, certainly from my perspective, I mean, to me, building a business case for third-party risk management, it's got to tie into examples. I'm not a big, for years in the security industry, we've talked about, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, like, never use, FUD to try to sell your security program. I think that guidance is sort of aged, truthfully. I mean, I think the reality is you need to educate executives and stakeholders on what's going on in the world. You can't expect your CEO to be spending half the day just, trolling for news stories and finding out what's going on. And if they're going to hear things, all the executives might come across stuff, but I think we need to come prepared as security and risk professionals to say, look, these are things that are impactful. These are things that are relevant in terms of trends and significant areas of focus that we should all be emphasizing and prioritizing, and here's why. So I think using examples, and I think, sort of building the business case around exactly what could go wrong and now has gone wrong goes a long way to, sort of making that realization. Maybe we have some gaps there. Maybe there's a lot of things we don't know. As Scott just said, the discovery is the hard part, but we still need to do it. Right. So I think you just got to make that business case based on what's really happening out there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you don't like ambulance chasers, but every time there's a data breach that is a third party data breach of some kind, that's a great example to get in front of your executive team to say, hey, look, this impacted them and this is what we think the impact would be to them. And they're kind of downstream based on what happened with the vendor. This could be us. Here's where we are now, but here's where we could be. To kind of close something up off in the back. A metric I sometimes use is how much risk you can buy down from the business. It's hard to quantify what risk means, but you can calculate some of that through like the data breach report and the Pwnymon report and stuff. And then every time you do an assessment, you remove incrementally a little bit of that risk and the value of that risk out of the business. And that can make a compelling case to a business owner.
Agreed. Yeah, can't keep your head in the sand though.
No.
That's really not an option anymore.
Nope.
Well, thank you both. I think one last question here. So any suggested training for third-party risk management?
I mean, obviously, I teach for SANS, and I know that a number of our SANS courses in audit and risk have some component of that, but I don't know that there's one that wholly emphasizes that topic. So I don't know that I'm much help here, sadly.
Yeah, same from my perspective. I mean, Shared Assessments does a pretty good job of communicating industry framework type data and explaining the SIG questionnaire and the SA and all that stuff. Pretty good source of info on the industry there as well.
And also a shameless plug for Prevalent. We have a lot of blogs and
Well, I didn't want to say that, but you did, so
I'm happy to.
Somebody's got to say it.
Yeah. Yeah. Check out our website because we got a ton of great stuff. Any last minute questions that come to top of the mind, you can send them now. Otherwise, we will start to close this down, give you a couple minutes back in your day. Thank you so much, Dave. That was really informative. And I think you gave a lot of people stuff to think about. Scott, thank you as well for going deeper into how Prevalent can help with maturing that third-party risk management program. So if you have any questions, please reach out. I will be following up with those of you that did register. So expect an email from myself or my colleague Amanda Farina. We're here to help. Thank you both. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Hey, take care, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks so much. Bye.